extremely pleased to be here with you. Just because I don't know many of you, how many of you come to the center regularly here? And how many of you are here for the first time or the first few times? Okay. Of those of you who are new, did you see Swami Kriyananda when he was in Bangalore last month? Did any of you see him? Okay. Well then, here we go. My name is Asha, and I have come to spend several weeks in India, traveling to several cities talking. I am part of Ananda in America. I am a founding member of the first Ananda community, which started back in 1968, and also with my husband David have started another community near San Francisco in the Silicon Valley area, where probably a lot of your relatives live. Yeah. There's not one Indian person who comes to visit me who doesn't have a relative somewhere in the area. They all have to go visit my cousin's sister's son's brother or something like that, somewhere, everywhere. So I know that you know that area as much as I do. I lived for the first 16 years of my spiritual life. I was in what is our country ashram. We call it Ananda Village. The last 25 plus years, I've lived in an urban setting, not quite as urban as this, but close to it. Haridas and Roma, for a couple of years, also lived in that ashram with us. During all of these years, ever since I very first came to Swami Kriyananda, and I'll talk a little more about that, I have been asked by him to talk about the teachings and to tell others about the teachings. And this year he asked me to leave California more and travel around the world, and this is the beginning of that. And it's a very auspicious beginning as far as I'm concerned. This is the first evening that I am sharing on this tour, so to me it's extremely auspicious and the beginning of, for me, a great adventure. I have had in my life many opportunities to learn from Swami Kriyananda, and from the beginning of my relationship with him, which started when I was 22 years old in 1969, which is a great deal, really all of my life. I actually say that I grew up at Ananda, and inasmuch children have actually been born and grown up there, that's what people think I mean, but they start doing the math and it doesn't quite work. But I feel, in a very true sense, that I just simply got a body and learned how to use it, but I didn't really know anything about what my life was really about until I met Swami Kriyananda, until I came to the ashram and began to understand these masters and the principles of self-realization. That was really the beginning of my education. Everything before that, in truth, even when I think about it, I felt like I just sort of stood against the wall and waited for the right thing to happen. And when it finally did happen, I seized it without hesitation, which I count to be very, very, very good karma, and I'm very grateful for that. What I want to share with you tonight is a little bit of my own story, because I have been asked to talk a little bit about it, and everybody's story is the same story. So when one person talks about the experiences that they've had, we're really talking about all of our experiences. In fact, I wrote a book about Swami Kriyananda, which is on our shelf back here, and what it is, it's just a collection of stories, my own and those that I collected from people and from many places, of experiences that they've had with him that in some way shifted their consciousness in an upward direction. Because that's really, when you come down to it, the story of a saint's life is how his consciousness changes the consciousness of others. We revere the individual, but what we really revere is the effect that he has on us. I was speaking to my host, Neelam, earlier today, just asking certain questions that I've wondered about for a time. I was asking her about the role that Jesus plays in the life of Indian society and people who become involved on our spiritual path, where Jesus is one of the gurus and we pray to Jesus, and how do you all relate collectively, as if there is no one answer to that, but I have been curious. The reason I bring it up is because I was thinking trying to express something helpful to you all today about what this spiritual path really is and what it means to us, not only for what we can get from it, but also how we can give to it. Because I'm sure all of you are old enough and mature enough in your life experience to realize that when the greatest blessings come to us, it's always because we're in a flow of energy. Whenever we merely sit on the sidelines and try to ask, what can I get from this, much less happens than when we enter into it and also become part of the flow of energy that's also giving. When Yogananda came, and I always say came to America, he was born in India, but the fascinating paradox of his life is being born a Bengali in Calcutta, growing up in this culture, but yet the majority of his mission happened starting in Los Angeles, California. And now that being well established, a lot of us from California are coming back to India, sort of trying to tie the whole thing all together. I am a Jewish girl. I was raised in a Jewish family. I was born in El Paso, Texas. I joined an Indian ashram when I was 22 years old. And now I'm in Bangalore talking to all of you about the teachings of these masters. I think we have entered a new age. I think something is happening here that has never happened before. And when a great sage, when a great avatar, especially when a whole line of masters like this come to incarnate, they don't just come casually. They don't just randomly choose a time to come, although I'm completely interested in a remark apparently that Paramhansa Yogananda made, speaking of Lahiri Mahashaya. He said, Lahiri was lucky. In his incarnation, there were no wars. And Yogananda said, already in my lifetime, there have been 3. First, Second, and the Korean War from America. And when a master whose consciousness is so sensitively attuned to the vibrations of the whole planet, you can imagine how deeply he feels that experience. But it was such both a cosmic and such a personal remark. It's always been of interest to me. But more profoundly, when Swami Kriyananda and when Master also, Yogananda, speak of this line of masters descending, in Autobiography of a Yogi it is written, and also in Swami Kriyananda's book, The Path, he talks about how Jesus and Babaji, who is well known to all of you here, the deathless Himalayan yogi, that Jesus and Babaji together have planned the salvation of the planet at this time. That they have been, I love this, deeply concerned about the over-materialistic direction of our culture and the increasing capacity of man to create violence against one another with ever more technologically sophisticated, and they have planned the salvation of this age. And the plan that they have created is this path of self-realization. Now, I don't put that forward so that we can say that we're the best and we've got the one or anything like that, because there are many true paths to the same goal. But once one becomes interested in a particular path, or far more deeply committed, as I know many of you are, we have to think not only about my personal relationship to this, but also, what have I gotten myself involved with? How, and I'll put it in very simple terms, can I also be a friend to the masters who have befriended me? When I first met Swami Kriyananda, as I said, I was 22 years old. I had discovered the teachings of self-realization about 3 years earlier, when someone gave me the book Karma Yoga by Swami Vivekananda, which was actually a transcription of some talks that he had given. And so my first years on the spiritual path were deeply devoted to, especially to Paramhansa Ramakrishna. When I finally, many years later, went to his temple at Dakshineshwar, it was such a fulfillment, almost like of a childhood dream for me. He brought me this far. And I had a very austere attitude toward the spiritual path. Vivekananda is a very, intellectual orientation. Of course, Ramakrishna is all heart, but he was very intellectual, and I loved that. And I learned all the principles, and I talked about it with my friends. But I could not figure out how to get from these magnificent ideas into a different way of life. I was living at that time in the city of San Francisco. I was living at 4th and Geary, which is right in the downtown. I had a job on Montgomery Street, which is like Wall Street. It's a business district. I rode the bus back and forth. I would do my job. I worked in a legal office just as a secretary. I had no profession. I worked as a secretary. I'd take the bus back and forth. And in the evenings, I would read and contemplate these great teachings, but every day my life was just the same. And I began to become intensely concerned that all of this would just kind of be a cloud and it would go by. I started reading the lives of saints. I read all about as many saints as I could find of all traditions. But, I read about Himalayan yogis, or I would read about these cloistered nuns, or I'd read about the desert fathers. And here I was at 4th and Geary riding the Montgomery Express down to my office and coming back. And I found the Valmiki Ramayana at that point. And I read the whole, it was 1,000 pages. I read it on the express bus back and forth. And I remember I became so engrossed in the story that when Ravana stole Sita and Sita was being held prisoner and Rama didn't know where she was, I was on the bus and I was reading it like this, and I looked up and I was astonished that everybody's life was just going on as normal. Didn't they understand? Sita was in the hands of the evil demon. Rama didn't know where she was, I was so enraptured in this. But still, every day was just the same. And circumstances brought me into the presence of Swami Kriyananda. And by the grace of God, he walked into the room. He was 43 years old at that time. He's 86 now. As I said in Chennai, half the age. Very powerful man, extremely powerful, just strode right into the room with all this energy. I was sitting at the farthest edge of the room from where he walked in. The instant he walked in the door, it was like his aura went everywhere. And I recognized it. I would say I recognized it as my own, but I also recognized the consciousness that I wanted to have, and it was the first time I had ever seen it manifested. I knew theoretically that it existed because I'd read it in these books, but I had never seen anyone who had made those books into himself, made those principles into himself. And I, as I said the other day in Chennai, I said instantly, without any thought, he has what I want, just like that. And that was it. He hadn't even spoken, but I saw it. So where I was going with this was, I made the decision at that point that wherever he was in the world, I would go there, because this is what I had been looking for. If he had been in Antarctica, living in an igloo, I would have gone there. But as it happened, it was much more interesting. He was starting a community. He was up in the mountains of California. It was totally fun in addition to everything else. But I went with this extremely austere thought. I am going to learn from Swami Kriyananda. I had all my books and my images of what it meant to be a disciple and how you go sit at the feet of the master. And I just went with that attitude. And he was gracious enough to allow me to be however I was going to be. And quite soon I was in his company a great deal of the time. But he was building this community. He was talking about the mission of these masters. He was talking about Yogananda's intention in coming to the West. He was talking about Babaji and Jesus having this great compassion for the world and all that they were planning. And I just looked at all of it and I said, that doesn't have anything to do with me. I'm here for my self-realization. I went on like this. It must have been at least a couple of years. I can't picture it exactly, but I picture the moment it changed. Ananda Village now is about 1,000 acres, and then it was substantial enough that to get places you would have to drive in a car. And I was often in the back seat of the car what Swami was in the front seat or even driving. And we would drive through the community because his home was at one edge, so we'd go back and forth. And we were driving through the community one day. I was looking out the window at the community, which I was participating in, but I had no commitment to it. And I realized that Swami Kriyananda was pouring every ounce of his energy, his lifeblood, his health, all his thoughts, all his creativity into building this community. And I was just sitting back, too snooty, really, to be involved in it. And I realized there was something really seriously wrong with this picture. And Swami had talked to us many times, speaking everything he tells us is what Yogananda tells us. And Master talked about the highest form of human relationship, interestingly, is friendship, he says. Because he says every other relationship, husband and wife, even mother and child, has an element, as he puts it, of compulsion in it. You know, the baby is born, the mother must take care of it or the baby will die. The mother also feels compelled by her own love for that child, but still, you have to do it. A wife has a duty to a husband to a wife, then child to its parents. But friends choose to be friends. And so it is a relationship of perfect freedom in which also there is a certain equality of consciousness, although there is mutual respect. And there is also, as Jesus says in the Bible, when his disciples called him Master, Jesus said, "You call me Master, but I call you friend." Because a servant may carry out his master's business, but he does not take his master's business as his own. But a friend, together we move through life. So I'm sitting here thinking about this, and in those days especially, Swami Kriyananda, for many years, never allowed any of what I would call the accoutrements of his spiritual position. It was better in America at that time not to do it. Nobody knew anything about spirituality seriously, and it was quite a circus, is the word, of people declaring themselves self-realized and becoming gurus, and it was a mess. And he didn't want to have anything to do with that. Plus, people were mindlessly looking for someone to tell them what to do, and he wanted serious devotees. So he behaved very casually. It was, in truth, since he's come to India in 2003 and then gone back, he's allowed much more of what we all felt for him to actually be expressed. But so the relationship of friendship was very real. He was younger, he was just a different man at that time. Not in consciousness, but in personality. But I was in the back seat of the car and I thought, what a crummy friend I am. You know, this is so important to him. He's putting out so much energy and I'm helping him, but only half-heartedly. My concern is just for what I can get, not for what I can give. He wouldn't have known that to look at me or to watch me, but in my heart, it was true. And then I began to think on so many levels. We take from the masters, and what can we give back? You know, I was in a position with Swami Kriyananda where I could make him supper. I used to sew his clothes, you know. I was able to do more personal service than some people have had the opportunity to do, but I just did that for a few years, and then he sent me on my way. He let me do that for a while, and then he basically booted me out and sent me off to do something else. But still, there was a little bit of that. But in the great scheme of things, you know, what does a shirt matter? It's a pleasure to make it, but what does it really matter compared to what the masters have come to do? So we receive this extraordinary gift of clear teachings, divine inspiration, inner attunement, for many of you the practice of Kriya, you know, the whole story of Lahiri Mahashaya coming to Babaji, receiving again this teaching which has been hidden for so long, and that beautiful moment which is described in Autobiography of a Yogi where Babaji says, give this technique only to those who are willing to renounce everything in the search for God. And in essence, Lahiri Mahashaya says, well, I guess I won't be giving a lot of initiations then. He didn't say it quite that casually, but he may have, because of course the masters have a great sense of humor, which is often lost. But he said, that's a very difficult criteria. So many people would benefit from this. Can't we make it a little easier? And then Babaji says, through you the divine has spoken. And give it to all who sincerely seek. And so that was a great day for all of us. That was a really big day. If we ever know what day that is, we should celebrate it all the time, right? Because that was the day that we were allowed to be given this path of Kriya. And this path of Kriya, of course, through this meditation, this ancient way of meditating, which was held more in secret until recently, till recent times, because we're coming up in consciousness as a planet. How do we say thank you? You know, you offer things at the altar, but what does that really ask of us? So over many years, starting from that moment sitting in the back of the car, I've had to really ask myself, why did these masters incarnate? There's something called the Festival of Light, which I know there's a lot of festivals of light, but Swami wrote a ritual, which I'm sure you have seen at least some. In America, we repeat it every week. It's just the way we run our temples, that every week we have this repeating ritual, which ends with a blessing, but there's also a number of pages of ideas that are presented, and we present them over and over again, poetically spoken, so that we can get very, very deeply into those thoughts. The power of ritual, repeating ritual, is that if the ideas are subtle enough, you find them on a deeper and deeper level. I've been reading or listening to that festival virtually every Sunday for 27 years. And there's not one time I go through it when some part of it, I want to stop. I'm reading it in this ritualistic way, and I want to stop and say, did you hear that? Did you understand what that meant? Well, one of the lines in there, speaking of the masters, greater can no love be than this. From a life of infinite joy and freedom in God, willingly to embrace limitation, pain, and death for the salvation of others. Such is the sacrifice of the great masters for the world. Now, it's no sacrifice for them in the sense that they have a state of bliss consciousness, but it helps us tune in that they've taken incarnation for our purpose and for the sake of saving us. Sister Gyanamata, who was Yogananda's most advanced woman disciple, her book, God Alone, is on the shelf there if you haven't read it. Except for the autobiography and the writings of Kriyananda, it's the best spiritual book I know. She's a pure disciple. Teaches you everything about discipleship. She wrote a letter to Master and said, I know you have a great world-changing mission, sir, and I am wholeheartedly in support of that. But in my heart, I like to think that you came just for me. Isn't that so sweet? Just for me. And she's, as a great disciple, that's how she feels about it. I like to think you came just for me. And he did. But if we're going to be really a friend to your guru, a friend to the spiritual path, if we're going to create the circle of energy that gratitude and reciprocity makes, if we only take, we get very little. Because if we're only taking, it's a one-way flow and it's about this big. We need to give back to the masters in a way that matters to them. And what matters to them? The salvation of others. And more specifically, interestingly, this is such an interesting path that we're on. For me, this was what I loved about it. I have a very inquisitive mind, and I love to think about things. And I was saying to Neelam laughingly, my mother says, I just began to talk as soon as I could possibly begin to talk. And I think I talked all the time. I go to a swimming club near where I am, the YMCA it is, and there's a lot of families and children there. I like it for that reason. And this woman came in with a little girl. The girl was about 5. And they walked in the door. The girl was talking. And she talked continuously the whole time she was with her mother, except when she was actually underwater. And as soon as she came up again, she had something to say about being underwater. And I listened. Her conversation was interesting. She was just thinking about everything and putting it into words. The mother looked a little exhausted. When I had a chance, I sort of put my arm around her and I said, I know it's tough, but it's worked out well for me. I think, just put up with it. I've made a whole profession out of it. It's okay. But I have an enormously inquisitive mind, and I love to think about the teachings. And one of the things that makes this path, Master's path, especially the way this disciple, Swami Kriyananda, has articulated is, it's so interesting. And it just goes on in all directions and gives us all so much to do. Because Master came to change the whole direction of society. Swamiji in Chennai recently, I don't know if he said it here in Bangalore, but it's in Autobiography of a Yogi, Master says, I knew nothing about the Yugas, Kali Yuga, Dwapara Yuga at all until I read Autobiography of a Yogi, but I get the point that Sri Yukteswar corrected a misunderstanding to say that we're not in this very long period of Kali Yuga, the Dark Age, but we've entered into Dwapara Yuga proper. This is a correction that he made. First I heard about it was the correction, so I never knew there was any dispute. But what that means is we are in a period of ascending consciousness. There's another aspect to that which is fascinating to me, which is that nothing that has happened in the past is actually relevant to the future. Because when we're in an ascending age, especially when we're at the cusp of the shift of the yugas, which is why these masters came right at this point, because to take the planet into a new reality. That's the story of the Mahabharata and Krishna from the other side, from exactly the same point, but from the other side. Dwapara going into Kali Yuga. That's why Krishna did such shocking things. He had Yudhishthira tell a lie. He held the sun in the sky. He did things that everyone said were so, against Dharma. But Krishna said, we're going into a darkening age. This is just how we have to behave now. Because he really did come to shift it. And it had to happen. Fortunately, I suppose, we're going up. But what's fascinating to me about all of this is I started coming to India in 1987. Myself, my husband, and two friends of ours, we started, it was sort of a business, actually. We started a business of bringing American devotees to India to visit the places that are mentioned in Autobiography of a Yogi, in the footsteps of the Master. For the next 20 years, about 12 or 13 times, we brought groups of Americans over. So I became very familiar with a very small slice of India, just those little pilgrimage places, which was no hardship, believe me. But just since then, since 1987, India has completely turned over. And everything about this country now is shifting. We're going in a completely new direction. And very little of what is happening now can be referenced from the past. The whole technology, computers, there's just no tradition to match it. The same is true in America, although we're more used to it, because we have no history. We're just a couple of 100 years old and we never accomplished anything. It was just nothing there. So everything is in front of us. We have no great traditions. That's why Master came to America, because it was just essentially a level, flat place. He could just plant this new reality. When I first came to Ananda, I came to our remote country ashram in 1971 is when I moved there. And we lived what I would call a sort of fantasy life for the first 10 years. We had like this sort of fantasy idea of what Indian culture must be like, and we just played it out. We had Indian names, we wore Indian clothes, we did lots of Indian chanting. Swami Kriyananda had recently come from India. He actually knew. We were just making it up. None of us had ever left the country. He would walk, but he wore a dhoti often and Rudrakshamala, and he was living very much in Indian consciousness. So I thought that self-realization teachings that Master taught was actually based in the Indian culture until I came to India. And then I realized, if you can understand this, that what Master brought is about as Hindu as it is Catholic, which is that you can kind of see little bits and pieces of it, And if you know Catholicism, you can kind of see little bits and pieces of it, because it was Babaji and Jesus together. Babaji, Krishna, who was Krishna in a previous incarnation. It's the two of them together, but what they're creating is something completely new. And it's about everything that you're learning. It's not new in the sense that it's a new invention, but as Yogananda said, it's a new expression. And as devotees of this path, this is what's so fascinating, is that we're really molding a new reality for a new age. And that reality will be molded by us. And this is where I mentioned way back at the beginning about Jesus, because the history of Christianity, of course, is so well known in the country that I grew up in. Even though I grew up Jewish, you still learn it. And after I got to know Master and read his interpretations of the New Testament, I was really glad I didn't know anything else, because I got to learn it as self-realization, which is really how Jesus taught it. Not how the church teaches it, but how Jesus taught it. But Jesus, of course, was crucified, which even people who know nothing know that. And so he was executed as a common criminal. He had 12 disciples, and one of them betrayed him. So he had 11 good ones, and he had his mother and a few others sort of hanging around. But when he died, it was assumed that he would be wiped off the face of the earth and never heard from again, except for his most devoted disciples, many of whom ran away from him when that horrible end came to him. No one would have believed, except those who really felt and knew who he was. And even more powerfully, those who then decided that I didn't come to this by accident, and my Master had a mission, and I am his friend. And what was of importance to him is important to me, and because we're going to guide our lives by something. We're always guiding our lives by something. So what will that something be? Even our own self-realization. How do we even attain that self-realization? Guru Seva is one of the finest ways to attain that. The good karma of helping others is what gives us new spiritual opportunity. And even more than that, the instrument is blessed by that which flows through it. The more we have committed ourselves to being instruments of these teachings, to really deeply understand what these masters have taught us, and then learn how to carry that forward. How specifically each one of us does that, how collectively each of our little families finds a way to do it, is something that we just have to go step by step. I've been part of building 2 Ananda communities now. I actually thought I'd be part of building more than that, but it's been 2 so far. And it's not as if we had it all charted out. We had no 5-year plan. We had no 2-year plan. We barely had a daily plan, really. But we had a very, very deep commitment to guide our lives by Guru Seva. Guru Bhakti, Guru Seva. Like, why not? I often would think at the end of my life, when the life review comes, I'm sure the books in India are just as popular as they are in America. All these people who are having what they call near-death experiences, but death in return, and you find out about your life review and how you get to talk about what you did. I very often weigh things in my life against that life review. How will I explain to Master what I did and didn't do? How will I explain my lack of courage or my lack of clarity or my lack of commitment? It's a very powerful way to weigh your life. I was talking to Neelam in the car coming over about, she was talking about her mother-in-law who died quite unexpectedly a year ago, just sort of suddenly moved into the astral world. A friend of mine, her husband, he had been ill, but he had seemingly recovered. He got up in the night and he was walking into the bathroom, and he stepped from the bedroom into the bathroom, but he actually stepped into the astral world. When he just took that step, and in that moment, his soul went into the astral world and his body fell and he passed away. Very often when I get up in the night and I go to the bathroom door, I think, will this be the moment? Where will I be when I step through this? I hope you don't consider that morbid. I love the idea of just leaving everything behind, going to the astral world. We're going to do it someday. We might as well be ready for it. You think it's going to be far away, but when it happens, it's now. No matter when it is, we might as well always be ready for it. And living our lives by that thought. Why are we here? What can we do? How can I give? And primarily, how can I be more in tune with that which is guiding my life? And I can't recommend it highly enough. I've been with Roma and Haridas in this since the beginning. Haridas was one of the first people I met when I got to Ananda village. In fact, he was living in a teepee, and I put up my tent too close to his teepee, and he could hear the clanking of the pots and the silverware, and he came over and the tent had to be moved. But to his credit, he helped in that very awkward task. Subsequently, I don't know if you remember, but Haridas apologized. About 25 years later, he apologized for being so picky. But it was a great lesson for me at the time because he was so cheerful about the task. Determined and insistent, but nonetheless cheerful. We were living in buildings with canvas walls. I mean, now we live in so much noise, it just seems ridiculous, but that was what our lives were like then. But let's see, where was I thinking with that? Well, you know, your life is made up of one day at a time. That's what I was really going to say. All of us, you age, you don't even know that it's happened. But everything about your life is the decision that you make one day at a time. And the more we can bring everything in our lives into harmony with the highest ideals that we live by, the more that they become our every breath. And there's very simple reason for doing that. It decreases suffering and it increases happiness. Even as Krishna says, even a little practice of this inward religion will save us, and I love this, from dire fears and colossal sufferings. Isn't it comforting? You know, these are the words of self-realization of Kriya Yoga. Well, in the time I have allotted, that is what I had to say. Do we have any questions or thoughts that I can expand on from that? I usually talk too, except when I'm underwater, so I could go on. Any thoughts or ideas?
Did you at any time feel that your devotion was waning?
My devotion was waning?
Did you ever in last years?
Everybody goes through better and worse periods. Sometimes those bad periods last for long periods, like weeks, months, years even. You could have bad years on the spiritual path. Did I ever doubt for 1 minute that I was in the right place doing exactly what I was born to do? No. So in that sense, did my dedication or my commitment ever wane? No. Did I always have a good time doing it? No, not always. Ananda in America went through a huge period of testing in which we were faced with lawsuits, and it was about 12 years of very difficult, just chaos. Anytime you try to put out light, darkness attacks you. And in the very worst period of that, I said to my husband, it's a good thing I had some good years before I got into these years. Because if these were the only years, I'm not sure there would have been any after them. So yes, there is that reality. On the other side of it, is there times when I feel like the spiritual path is effortless? Are there times when I feel like it's just nothing but strain? You know, we have terrible periods in our lives. When I had to write that book about Swami Kriyananda, I just, in a personal way, even though I realize now I have a facility with writing, I think the word is phobic about it. I just had this enormous karmic anxiety about writing. When Swami Kriyananda, said, I always knew I had to write a book about him. I always knew from practically as soon as I met him. And I wrote notes for 30 years. When I had to try to write it, it was just a nightmare. I just couldn't. I was just so scrambled. I sat with that book for 3 years. At the end of 3 years, and I worked on it pretty much, it was my main job. I had nothing, and I don't exaggerate. I didn't have one sentence, not one sentence. But this was my response to that. This has been a very difficult karma for my whole life, this fear that I have of committing myself to this particular kind of work, which has always been asked of me and always has been very difficult to do. I really don't want to see another incarnation of this. This incarnation has been bad enough. I really don't want to see this again, and I will die trying. If it is the rest of my life just sitting here uselessly trying to write this book, I will die trying, because what else can I do? And right about that time, just the dam broke, and I figured out how to write it, and then it took me a year to write it. But then I was actually writing. And after that, and especially after the book I just wrote, it's sort of all settled in my mind now. But the real point of that is, if we're not enjoying what we're doing, if our devotion has waned, if our dedication gets really kind of sleazy for a while, whatever it might be, what future is there in not persevering? What good will that do? And success on the spiritual path is when you realize that it's a matter really literally of life and death, of joy or sorrow, of bliss or pain. And what's happening now is interesting, but not deeply relevant to your commitment. It's just like, I'm in a good period, I'm in a bad period, but we're going above that. And one should emphasize as deeply as you can to your consciousness on the biggest level why you are a devotee, why you are a meditator, why you are seeking God, on levels that can't be touched by the pleasure and pain of the experience. Because if you're only doing it on the pleasure and pain of it, you'll get washed away. What makes you solid is when it has nothing to do with what's coming back to me. It has only to do with my absolute understanding of what choice do I have in life. Get away from my ocean of suffering, Krishna says. The world is, I don't like to emphasize it too much because fundamentally I'm a happy person. But I'm not happy because of what goes on. I'm happy in spite of it because of this. Does that make sense? I often say to myself when I want to give up, if you give up now, honey, you're just going to have to do it later. And when later comes, it's going to be now. And so that's just like, reincarnation for an American was a new idea. But because of my samskars, it didn't take me long to accept it. But I love reincarnation for this reason. There's no way to escape. There's just no way out. So if there's no way out, let's just do it. Because it's just not going to get any better. Rama said when his father asked him to stay one more night after being exiled, inevitable disappointment is not lessened by postponement. And I've always thought of that. The inevitable effort required here is not going to be less just because I put it off. In fact, it'll be more because I will have run away. So the answer to that is sure, some days are better than others. I remember when I was in a really terrible period, I said to my husband, David, this is a really terrible period of my life, and someday it won't be. And we've been together for 30 years, so we've been through a lot of it. Then it was good. Again, I say, David, this is a really wonderful period of my life, and someday it won't be. It helps just to say it out loud. Just puts you outside of it a little bit. And then he's also a witness to remind me, remember what you said? Yes, dear. Yes?
I have a question. Ashaji, just want to know, let us say we are committed to the path of self-realization, 100%, 200% committed. Is it possible to achieve the self-realization in this life, or we should take a birth as a master itself? Then only it is possible.
Well, the question of whether we can attain self-realization in this life, it's a very interesting one. Let me think. I've heard Swamiji say to us, you can become Jivan Mukta. You should strive to become Jivan Mukta in this lifetime. And some of my friends feel highly motivated by that. And they'll talk about, every time you'll say something about a future incarnation, they'll correct you, no, don't talk like that. Everybody is different. I have never felt motivated by that thought, I'm going to make it. In fact, when I only speak my own point of view, I call it the gospel according to Asha. Because it's very important to understand that this is not from Swamiji and this is not from Master. This is just my particular way of working it out. Swami Kriyananda, I believe, is a realized being. His guru told him that he would be liberated in this lifetime, which means, he must be Jivan Mukta now. This is just me saying this. He's never claimed this and he won't claim it. But he speaks of being in bliss all the time. And Master told him he would be free. That's what it looks like. That's what your last incarnation looks like. It doesn't look like this. This is good karma. I'm looking at good karma here. This is very good karma. This is sincere dedication. But that's what the last lifetime looks like. So I find it easier to say, I have got the good karma to be with these masters, to be a contemporary of Swami Kriyananda, to have all this opportunity to serve. I leave the rest of it to them. When they're ready to let me off of here, that's fine with me. And as long as they want me to keep chugging along, I'll also keep chugging along. In Swamiji's book, The Essence of the Bhagavad Gita, in one paragraph, he says, don't think about whether you're going to be liberated or not. Just take care of what you have to take care of, and it will take care of itself. I was very happy when I saw that, and I held it up to Swamiji. Look, I said, this is how it's always seemed to me. It seems to me that the less we think about ourselves, the more we think about Guru, the more we think about giving, finding bliss and giving it away, the closer we move to divine realization. To be concerned even about my own self-realization makes me think about myself more than I want to. Now, this is only for myself. I really want to be, because many people whom I love and respect deeply approach their spiritual life differently. But this works for me. Because by the time we're here, by the time we're sitting in the room with masters like this, by the time we can say, I am 100% sincere, we're right at the end. We're right at the end compared to how long it took to get here. So if it's a couple of more incarnations, I kind of hedge my bet too. I don't ever want to get sucked into being some of the things I was before I found the path of self-realization. So I think a lot. Instead of thinking about not having another incarnation, I actually think about having it. And I try to project into that little baby's body a completely sophisticated adult understanding of spiritual life. I want them to say about me, she was never a child, she was always an old woman. That would just be perfect for me. This is my way of dealing with it. It works for me. Perhaps it's helpful. Yes.
I have been lately, trying to associate myself, and I've kind of felt that I also belong to Ananda in many ways. And being recently that I've been part of it, I have one thing which always occurs to my mind, that in your search of self-realization or seeking God, in the scheme of the entire thing, where does a guru fit in? And what is the role of a guru?
We are always being influenced in our lives. I look at you now, you're very nicely dressed. You happen to be dressed in the style of the country in which you were born. You are also wearing a modern kurta. You are not wearing an old-fashioned one. Your earrings, your hair, your makeup, everything. Where did all that come from? You're being influenced all the time around you and picking it up. In America, where the fashion can be very extreme, there was a period of time when all the women were wearing these, it's hard to believe in this country, they were wearing these really huge black shoes, really ugly shoes. When fashion first starts, you always know it's ugly in America. But then after a while, you forget that it's ugly. And after a couple of years, I was with someone and I picked up a big black shoe and I said to my friend, "This is cute, why don't you try it on?" And then I looked at it, and I dropped it like that. How could I have fallen for it? We're always being influenced. So we don't have free will at all. We are very much the product. I mean, that's the smallest thing. Your language, your culture, your parents, your job, your aspirations. So it's not a question of whether we will be influenced. It's a question of what influence we choose to be the dominant influence in our life. So to actually imagine that with all the force of all these thoughts and all this hypnosis going on, that all by myself I can find and figure out what's really good for me, what's really going to take me forward, what's really going to give me happiness, what's really going to help me sort out all the confusion of the millions of vrittis of not only this incarnation, but all those incarnations. Well, good luck, but if you work at it for a while, you begin to realize, I don't have any idea which way is forward. And the mere fact that I feel it really strongly may only mean that it's a very strong delusion I've had for a long time. We need someone who has perspective. And of course, if you're going to have someone with perspective, you want it to be someone you can really trust. And you want it to be someone who's going to take you where you really want to go. And you want it to be someone who has the power to help you get there. And in very simple terms, of course, it becomes much more cosmic in its import. But that's really what the guru does in your life. If you want to learn Indian dance, if you want to learn to sing, if you want to learn to play the guitar, you go and find a teacher. Because you recognize they know how to do what I want to do. And I could maybe figure it out, but I might be doing things now that will inhibit my ability to be good at it later. And the guru in our lives is exactly that. It's like there's a constant tone. And really, literally, it's the Om, but it's the vibration of the divine consciousness just always radiating out. And it becomes like the central tone, and your life begins to, literally, to tune itself around it. And that's what the guru is. He's just always vibrating the right note. And so when your particular melody gets a little off, if you're constantly referring it back, you realize it can come back like this. The community also serves that. The satsang also serves that for you. In my spiritual life, growing up, I had a lot of opportunity with Swami Kriyananda, but my Guru Bhais were equally important to me. I knew Haridas before I knew Roma, but Haridas was one of my mentors because he had a certain positive way always of looking at life. And I would literally attune myself to Haridas, among others in my life, but he was one of them because I could feel that he was attuned in a certain way, and when I was off, I could find him because he was hearing the Guru's vibration, and then I could hear his vibration sometimes more easily than I could hear the Master directly. And we all serve each other in that way. But if we're not all attuned together to the right note, then we can't really serve each other either. And the Ananda friendships are very interesting. I call them they're vertical friendships. Everybody becomes the friend of the Master, and then in that friendship, we suddenly find ourselves completely in tune with each other. Even when we have very different personalities, very different cultures, and this will sound funny to you, and when we don't even really like each other. Some of your best friends on the spiritual path you don't really like much. But it doesn't matter because we're all attuned to the same thing, and so we're all just working our way through. That's where community comes in. That's why Master wanted communities for us. Self-realization fellowship, Yoga Satsanga, he called it, because it's not just the self-realization, it's the coming together, because that way we can all help each other. And in this age, it's too confusing out there to be out there by yourself. You'll end up thinking the black shoes are nice looking. You have to be really careful. And that's the least of it. Does that make sense? Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts? Swami Kriyananda, you see, has been Yogananda's instrument for making what Yogananda brought and manifesting it. And he's written all these books and so on. For like the last 15 years, I've been giving long study classes on Kriyananda's books. They're all on the internet. You can find them easily. You look up my name, Nayaswami Asha. I have a website, it leads you to all those classes. Because Swami Kriyananda's books really articulate, they draw Master's teachings out to a very specific focus in very specific ways. And I found, I was studying, and this is actually the first one I was reading when I thought of this, was Hindu Way of Awakening. It's a very good book, but not easy. I was working very hard to understand it, and it occurred to me that probably everybody was working very hard to understand it. And that's when I started doing study courses on his books, because I realized that, well, Swami brought what Master taught, and I can help take what Swami taught and make it easier to understand. And then I can explain it, and then you can find what he said, and we can all work together in that way to come to it. It'll keep you busy for the rest of your life. It's so much fun. Swami's written 140 books. This poor girl, she'd been with us about 2 years. Swami said, "Have you read this book?" "No, sir." "Have you read that book?" "No, sir." "Have you read this book?" "No, sir." And then finally she said, "You wrote them over 40 years. It's not fair." You know? And he said, "You're right. It's not fair." Then I told her about my classes, because you can skip a little bit that way. You can sort of at least pretend you've read them all. Anything else that I can offer you? One more, okay, and then we'll call it a night. Yes, sir.
Actually, I read the autobiography of a yogi, and from that, what I understood is Lahiri Mahasaya has led a worldly life, but still he has achieved, greatest level of self-realization in his lifetime, unlike other gurus. So, just wanted to know: is there a difference between two paths, or was that like because of some attachments, Lahiri Mahasaya, he faced more challenges and difficulties to achieve self-realization?
Actually, that's a slight misunderstanding, because all of these masters are avatars, which is to say, avatars, they were completely free, no karma, absolute liberation before they took that body. So Lahiri did not attain self-realization. He was from a life of infinite joy and freedom in God. He willingly incarnated, and he incarnated in a householder incarnation in which he had children, and I love this. He worked as a government accountant. If you ever think your job is dull, think about that. He worked as a government accountant for many, many years. That was his job. And he raised his family, and he did that because we're moving from Kali Yuga into Dwapara Yuga. And in Kali Yuga, when the age is grosser, and matter is heavier and everything is denser, the only way you can be spiritual is you have to push the whole world aside. So it was the age of the Himalayan yogis, of the desert fathers in the West, of the cloistered monasteries, where a young woman would enter a convent, she would shave her head, the thing would clang behind her, and she'd never go out again. And because that was the only way you could do it. You just couldn't live in the world and in the spirit. But in higher ages, when you think of the rishis of India, they often had partners. The rishi often had his wife, and they often had their children. And that was because in a higher age, where matter itself, the consciousness of the world as a whole is lighter, you don't have to repudiate one to embrace the other. So the shifting from Kali Yuga into Dwapara is bringing spirituality back into everyday life. And Lahiri was the harbinger of that. So he manifested, not for any lesson of his own, but purely as an example, that setting the tone, that we can be householders who are also completely devoted to God. And that's the purpose of his incarnation. Now I'm a Nayaswami, and you hear me keep referring to my husband. Roma and Haridas are Nayaswamis, and they obviously live together as a married couple and have for many years. The Nayaswami order was created by Swami Kriyananda, as Naya means new, but we are sannyasis to the same extent that any orange-robed Swami that you would see is. But Swami Kriyananda meditated on it deeply for a long time and really saw that marriage was no obstacle to complete renunciation. And in fact, within our community, there are many examples, and I would count myself among them, of married couples who have been as devoted to the spiritual path as any person could be, but have simply done it in partnership. I have not raised children. Roma and Haridas have raised a daughter, Even having children is no obstacle. I watched them. They raised their daughter without the slightest diminution of their dedication to God. And that's what we're coming into. That's what, well, here he manifested it as an avatar. But he manifested it as an avatar to set the pattern for us who are still striving to accept it as a discipline. Of course, you know, every path has its temptations. To be a renunciate in a cave, the temptation is pride and laziness. To be a householder in the midst of the world, the temptation is attachment and emotion and self-indulgence, and you know, but it's all the same. It's really, we just have to work out our karma, whatever it might be. Yeah.
Thanks for the connection.
Certainly. Okay. Well, that is the end of the hour, but not the end of the evening, because we have delicious food, yes? And I'm perfectly willing to keep talking even while we eat, so whatever you would like. I'm very, very happy to be here. This was my first formal presentation since I came to India on this tour, which is a whole beginning of a new mission for me. So thank you so much for being such a receptive audience. It's been a joy. God bless you.